The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the hosts and not the host's past, present, or future employers. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It is Brian, all by himself, for Breaking Down Security. This is a special podcast that we are doing with one of our sponsors. We don't normally do a lot of sponsors in the year, but we did one about a month and a half ago with Patrick Garrity from Blumera, and part of our cycle interview process with Blumera, we're bringing on one of the other stars of Blumera this week. His name's Nato Riley. Just as full disclosure, being a sponsor, they did pay for this time. So if you're listening to this and you think it's odd that we're talking about Blumera, they did pay for our time. So I want to be upfront and transparent to all the listeners out there about this. So you will hear me waxing poetic potentially about some Blumera items. Miss Berlin also is an employee of Blumera and did help engage us with this. So we do help her thank her for her work there. So Nato, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into information security and working at Blumera. How does that happen?
So I have a long history in working with cloud infrastructure, and then that led to me working with a lot of logging technologies, basically. And then even before that, I worked with HIPAA and PCI. So I kind of had experiences working in regulation that then moved to doing regulation with cloud, then trying to automate the regulations, and then you automate regulation with logs. So then that ended up with me going to work with SIM vendors. So then at this point, I've worked with a number of different SIM vendors, and I've built different types of SIMs from ground up, open source, closed source. If it's a SIM or SIM-based technology, I've probably touched it. And so then now that brings me to being here, because the kind of technology I like is logging and SIM technology. It's just a thing that I just like to do that.
Well, yeah, that's not something that people are like, it's exciting. People normally want to be popping shells and stuff, but I like looking at logs. Okay. I'm not going to, that works for me. I mean, if anything, you're helping the blue team do a lot of stuff that I would imagine is not a glamorous type positions, but I do appreciate the nuance there. So, so during our discussions about, what we're going to be talking about for Blumera, with these series of discussions, it came up, and you asked, you posted in the email to me, is like, discussing the challenges that come with not having good logging in place would be a great topic. We could also make it partly about how security maturity works, in the idea that security generally starts with awareness and visibility. And so I think that's great. I do appreciate, in terms of security maturity, we've talked on the show separately about maturity models like the CIS top 20 controls, which one of the first things is, know what you have running in your environment. And I think a lot of this comes from, having the logging, because knowing what you have in your environment, you can look up asset management, you can look up, what software is being done here. Part of the research that I had for this show, I found out the OMB document, or what the president of the United States put out shortly after he came in, was there's a logging maturity requirement that he has implemented, or asked to be implemented as part of his executive order, making it a requirement to mature a security profile or their organizations by logging certain things in stages. So there's a link in the notes that are accompanying this podcast with that PDF. The appendices talk about the different fields that they're expecting everyone to be doing. So all of that comes up to this point. How mature does an organization need to be to start logging? I mean, shouldn't this be like, day one, we're logging things? I mean, so what does it mean? I mean, what does it mean? I mean, yes, you need to be mature to log, but I mean, does that mean we're automatically not logging what we should be doing, or are we automatically logging too much?
It's one of the things that makes it a good question is anytime an organization starts, they're going to end up with, say, here's one tool, here's another tool. And in the beginning, especially as like an organization's new, things like what's going on with, say, your G Suite and all those things and your Google Analytics, things are kind of fairly centralized depending on how a company launches. But as a company starts to grow in general, if a company doesn't do a good job at keeping, say, like an inventory of the systems that they're getting, there comes a point that if you just don't even have just a basic inventory that you maintain is just like a core foundational task that you like in the beginning, it doesn't matter that much. But when things start to get busy, you start getting more employees, you start getting more systems and items. I would say having, say, a good logging system and having good practices in your company in a lot of ways probably matters more, because by the time things start to grow, if you already have things in place, like you keep your inventory clean, maybe in the beginning you just have an antivirus and an XDR solution, and that's all you need to track all of your what would be logging data, where just getting logging might be literally buying a single tool. But as a company starts to grow, it's important to have a plan in place for what happens when easy centralization might, I guess it comes down to like considering the risk of your business model. How hard is it going to be to start to keep all of your data in one place as your company starts to grow? And if you don't know how your company is going to scale already, if that's not like something that you have in the plans for, say, like a 3-year plan, then it can turn into a little bit of a nightmare if there's no process being packed along the way, is kind of how I see some of that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned growth. A lot of small companies don't ever assume that they're going to be acquired or they're going to be the acquiring agent. So, if you're not, if the plans are you're not planning for expansion, that's another whole podcast all by itself. But, we've had podcasts talking about M&As and, the complexity that's involved there. And you've pretty much taken in another whole organization, and, you're taking in their issues and their errors and stuff. So, if they're not doing logging, then, there's additional bits that you have to do to make sure that they're up to snuff, or that they're doing what's necessary. So we had, I was doing, like I said, research, and I found the government doc, but I also found some discussion on something called News Stack, and they're talking about logging and monitoring and why you need both. Is it possible to do monitoring without logging? And obviously, we know that you can log without monitoring, but can you actually monitor something without logging it?
I've been thinking about that lately, because I've been playing with basically like time series technologies, which like there's tools kind of like Prometheus, but there's still a logging factor involved somewhere, even with like a tool like something like Prometheus. But then, like, can you get security insights with something that's basically like time series based technologies? And then that asks a whole nother question of, maybe we can't monitor the same way if we're not going and then grabbing, say, logs that have metadata that has relevant data. Because if we get a log, then we're getting very specific bits of information that happen routinely in like a system's like programmatic journey with everything that it's doing, right? So logs are a little bit of like the history of a binary system in a way.
Right. Yeah, that was there's actually a question when you were talking about logging those things, that there was some questions that I had down later on here. So we started talking before the show, and one of the questions I had was, everybody is logging, and I asked that question before, but what are some of the first logs that most organizations are logging but not doing anything with, and why is that, and are those the right ones that they should be logging?
Ideally, if you have, say, an environment that has like an Active Directory or something along those lines, then like whatever your most like furthest reaching set of logs, so an active domain controller, something like that, whatever those logs are is generally where I would say start. But a lot of organizations who are new or just getting started might not even have that. So oftentimes, like, that's just not even an option or something that's there. So then you just grab whatever is on the operating systems for whatever system you're using. So if it's like a Windows server, just go grab those Windows event logs. And there's resources like Sysmon. So even with, say, like because since we do build Blumira, uh, if you're trying to get quick insights about an environment and you have an on-prem Windows server, then turning on, say, a logging feature that's on top of whatever your system's like primary, like as soon as you turn it on, it's not going to generate certain levels of logs or certain types of logs. So usually it starts with grab some operating system logs and then have something that generates an additional layer of logs that produce insights that are helpful, because not all logs are valuable is another tricky piece. So like with Windows, it's like sysmon. With Linux, it kind of comes down to what tools you're using and having like following like a tool-based approach if you're using Linux systems is kind of how I see it.
Okay. So you mentioned that was kind of interesting there. The logging your Active Directory. I had actually assumed that the logs for the OS itself. So like all of the employees logs would be pulled from their Windows or Mac or their Linux laptops or desktops and put into some place and then never looked at again, is how it normally goes. But have you ever and I don't know if what your role is in bringing customers on. Do you ever do a scoping like a pen test where they come in and go, hey, we want to log all the things, and you're like, whoa, you're a virtual company, you don't have a lab, you're running, to use a filthy word, zero trust. Sorry, we actually done podcasts with them too, but you're doing zero trust, you don't have a VPN, you're application heavy, you should be logging these first, these important things first, these application server logs first, not, Bob's Windows laptop. Do you go through that kind of assessment to say, hey, you should be logging these first, these should be the priority?
So generally, when getting someone set up, I usually recommend that they have a risk assessment available and some form of an inventory, because if they have that, then if they have a risk assessment, that's going to walk them through something that is pre-canned. There's tons of resources out there to kind of help them get that assessed, and they can get it more easily validated. And then that way they can start with that and not waste time just logging things that they don't actually need. Because it's so easy with logging technologies, because it's something that's time consuming to just end up wasting a lot of time where, hey, let's just go start logging some things. You can do that, but there are certain categories of logging that's a lot more valuable than, say, just getting logs off of, say, a salesperson's laptop directly, when versus if you're getting, say, Active Directory logs, you're getting, say, like Kerberos logging, which means the logs associated with every single system that's connecting to your centralized infrastructure upon the moment it occurs. And then if you take more time trying to get other things connected or logged after that, you're already getting like a very specific set of data that's coming in. So like in terms of like little pen tests, we do little pen tests where let's say someone wants to first just see what a notification looks like. We actually deploy honeypots, and that's always a fun one. And then show what it looks like if someone comes in and engages that honeypot. So that's one base pen test that we do. And then other things that we might do is, resources like email are wildly valuable because phishing is, well, if we're honest, like their phishing is just very common.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we'll do, say, like, for example, like an Office 365 rule-based pen test. Just what if someone did accidentally have something going on in their email? Maybe it came from a phisher, who knows what else. But just a little pen test to make sure that that item that would be a little more suspicious triggers. And then the value of that is to show like, okay, so let's take a look at something worth responding to versus this is just a log. I think one of the realities that maybe someone who hasn't dealt with macro logging environments like for years is it's not uncommon to see, say, 60 billion logs in a day in certain environments. And so if you're seeing that many logs, you're pretty much never going to get anywhere if you're trying to just like dig through all of that. And
sorry,
so
I'm a bit agog here. 60 billion. I'm like, oh my, shoot. Is that true? Is that typical, or is that like an outlier?
Well, like if we're talking about a mid to enterprise, that's pretty common. If we're getting down to a small company, you're more likely to see like 1 million logs in a day, or at least say like a couple 100,000 logs in a day. Like one of my smaller environments that I keep logging over, I think that one's like 20 million logs in a day, and that one doesn't
Right.
really have much going on.
Okay.
But yeah.
So 60 billion. Okay, just like you said, average. Are they logging too much then? And does that mean that they should be going back through and like removing some things? Or you mentioned about classification of logs. Does Blumira have a log classification of like, this is mandatory, you should be logging this, down to, yeah, we're going to log that for you, but unless is there a classification that Blumira uses?
There is, and that's a really good question. Both are really good questions, because you can, like, let's say that you poorly prioritize your logging, and then that's kind of outside of the logging machine. A logging machine is just going to do what you throw at it. But you as an organization, for getting the most out of anything you're sending logs at, there is a reality that sending data that you actually don't need creates significant overhead that also loses time for your developers, for your people. And we always want to keep in mind, like in these realms of employment, that labor is insanely expensive. So it's kind of like, and maybe this is an aggressive way to put it, but I always feel like sometimes, like, not prioritizing, you might as well be setting money on fire. It's better to just slow down rather than just like set money on fire.
Right. Right.
But yeah, you definitely want to prioritize. I would say some great, like, PCI has a baseline. If someone doesn't have PCI, you can find different models. Like there's a cybersecurity framework and some other generic government resources for how you might mature out. Like, where do we start? How do we not waste all of our time trying to get all of these logs from everything? And you are so right that it's more common than not, in my experience, having dealt with logging in somewhere north of 1,000 different unique companies at this point in my career. Most entities try to see all the logs. That's like what everyone generally, like the default in the market. I see it shifting. It used to be, it's like almost guarantee you talk to them, they're like, I want to see all the logs. People still do that. But we do at Blumira we do have a prioritization system of our own to kind of help show what that looks like. And the way we do it is we break it out is something a risk? If it's a risk, don't wake up at 3 a.m. if you get one of these alerts. It's going to waste your time, and wasting time is setting money on fire, right? So then if something is a suspect, okay, so like a risk, that might be like a misconfiguration. We had a port that shouldn't have been open, but there's no recon that seems to be hitting it. So let's maybe deal with it by the end of the week or something. Don't just leave it. Versus, like, say, a threat or a suspect would be, hey, we might be getting some recon on something over here, and something that's kind of anomalous that doesn't make sense. It could be that you hired a new admin or something. Who knows? And then if it's white noise, great, you can filter those things out. But then it has a different alerting level is how we designate that, so that then you could get, say, a cell phone alert if there's something within a given day that maybe you might care about, but then you can have it not alert you after certain hours if that's what you'd prefer. And then finally, we have our priority items and our priority threats, where if you get, say, like a priority one, something categorized as a threat directly, that means that there's probably something imminently in your environment, and that now you probably do want to wake up at 3 a.m. I know if it was like a company that I was running, I would, but I've done a lot of on-call in my life, and I don't know how many people have done a lot of on-call, but you gotta do what you gotta do.
Right. So when you're onboarding new customers, do you tailor these for each individual customer? So do you have specific rules, based on, that threat model you mentioned, threat modeler doing the pen test? Is that all, is it all bespoke and per customer, or is there like some overarching kind of policy that you reach out to other folks like that?
There's some education behind this question too that I don't want to leave out, because one thing that we do with this is when you're trying to see if I can come up with the best way to put it. Um, so when you're trying to designate your logging, we follow an approach of like, what does your stack look like your software stack, regardless of how many servers you have, regardless of where that stack resides. Is it, do you use, let's say, Azure? Do you use AWS in your stack? Do you use Meraki, Carbon Black? What's in your stack? We kind of follow that approach, which then does require the customer to figure out like, okay, so then I need to make sure that I have enough inventory knowledge and awareness to be able to really get something out of this. And then we do very specifically deploy rules based on our customer stacks that we do help with as well on top of that. So we do that parsing. And one thing that is fairly universal about SIM and is just worth knowing about SIM technologies. And people ask all the time, like, why is SIM so expensive? One of the reasons why SIM as a technology is so expensive is because creating rules or creating what you might consider otherwise a knowledge base, which is just a set of rules that someone had to manually write, like parsing rules for. You could think of this as clear logic. And if anyone's ever heard of fuzzy logic implies that a system is contextualizing information automatically. But in the realm of compliance, and if you're doing forensics, SIM technologies and regulations like PCI, HIPAA, NIST, you name it, have requirements for that clear logic that says there's a human touch and there's some validation involved that comes with this. And so as a result, whether it's Blumira, whether it's Logarithm, Splunk, or it doesn't really matter, it could be Rapid7, it doesn't matter what it is, they're going to require parsing. And the way that different SIM platforms handle parsing in a lot of ways is what sets SIM platforms apart from each other. And say, if you're trying to work with a very large collaborative data science-led team with at least 20 developers, if I'm just going to be blunt, you're probably going to be looking at solutions like Logarithm or Splunk that are designed for large teams to come in and interact directly with each other for creating parsing at scale with full-on parsing teams. And that right there, the cost in the parsing alone is one of the most expensive and time-consuming pieces. But then, like a small business, like they don't have that kind of time and money usually. So then it becomes trickier for, say, especially a really small company, is it even worth paying for? And that's the first question to ask. Like, what's the risk around even trying to afford this? Time, cost. It's rather insane if not approached carefully, right? And with all these new regulations coming in, it adds pressure on the small business and medium-sized businesses where they need to suddenly have that same capacity for parsing and all those things. And one of the things that we do at Blumira in particular is we take the parsing off of folks. And so the reason why I put it that way is that is months and hours and all of that time taken off of the hands of someone else. The difference between even, say, like a platform like Logarithm is you have to go and tune all of the parsing yourself. You have to go set up those templates. And that by itself could take 6 months, because I used to go and implement those. And while I think that stuff is fun, just because it's fun doesn't mean it's affordable. Right. And so for smaller companies who just don't have time for that, sometimes having that extension of your team and having like a direct research extension organization, I find that to be a greater value than whether or not you need logging in a lot of ways, because that labor is a little worse than just trying to add logging by itself. So that's kind of how I see that. I know that was like a long overarching like wrap around to add context to the concept, but I think the context is relevant.
No, I think that's great. One of the things that people, I have been asked a lot of times about, managed services, well, yeah, we've got a security team in house. We can do that ourselves. It does take time and effort to do that. And if your internal team is spending that time and effort to tune something, one, are they logged analysis specialists? Are they dedicated to that? And also, there's an opportunity cost here. It's like they could be spending the time tuning a log or a Splunk or a logarithm, and that's an opportunity cost lost somewhere else where they could be doing something that's more effective for the doing malware analysis, or doing other things that would be there's opportunity cost lost there by not engaging dedicated people like Blue Mirror, for instance, to do this log tuning. And your professional log tuners, much like what if I had a car that required a tune-up, would I try to do the tune-up myself? No, because I'm not a specialist in that. I would take it to a shop that has the specialized tools and knowledge to do so. So I argue that if you're a small company, yeah, spend the money to have a professional do your log tune-ups, and spend that money, spend the time that you would have done or tried to do it yourself, building out your company and getting better and spending that time. So cool. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I do appreciate the back on that. So you mentioned network stack. Are there network stacks, or the Herokus of the world, or the Log4, the various systems out there? Are there ones that are better than others at logging? And what happens if they don't give logs? Is there a way to, find that out? I think we talked about some of this from a hardware point of view, but, I was just thinking maybe there's application stacks that aren't so well at, logging things effectively. And how would you find those abilities to log those events if they're not good at it in the first place?
This is an especially good question for people just trying to get a new project off the ground. So for anyone listening, you're just like, oh, I'm just trying to figure out where to even start. Someone who already has stuff, that's another story. So if you have any way to focus on technologies that have API-based logging, regardless of what you use, period, API-based logging can dramatically simplify your long-term log management, your long-term centralization. And even if it takes a little time in the beginning, especially on, say, brand new. So for anyone who hasn't launched a number of new business initiatives or MVPs or anything like that, what you'll run into is the early days of your project. Oftentimes they can feel really slow and nothing's happening. And those are oftentimes the best times to line up your stacks, line up okay, so what technologies are we going to choose and why, and choose some of these little nitpicky things that might seem well, who cares right now? I like this one better, so we're just going to use this. But how is it going to log? Because if you're starting a real project, if that project takes off, what I have also then run into is the second a project starts taking off, you suddenly have, it's really hard to get back to trying to adjust things or modify things. And whatever that foundation you have at launch is, whatever's missing from your launch stack or whatever's complicated from your launch stack creates overhead when you do get into these things. Because whether while I think this stuff is fun, what I have also learned that it's given me a career, because most people don't think it's that fun. So they're like, oh, sweet, give it to Nato. And I'm like, oh, sweet, I get all the stuff that I like to do. Well, no one else wants to do it though. But it's reality.
Right. Yep. So, I was thinking, we talked about logging and monitoring earlier. If you have a company that is giving you their application logs and it's through API, let's say, yes, we've implemented an API and you're able to pull those down real easy. What is there a good and a bad way of setting those APIs up to make sure that people can log? And obviously, and I've seen this at where I work, sometimes you log the wrong things in those, and some of the government framework that is being asked for, it was log usernames and things where appropriate. They say where appropriate, because there are some logs where you don't want to put usernames and or other identifying data in those logs. So is there a good way to log and in those, and how do you keep it from do you ever go in and you look at these logs and you're like, hey, I probably shouldn't be logging that, or you shouldn't be logging it this way? Is there a good and a bad way of doing that?
Yes, especially depending on the kind of business you run. The first ones that hit me real hard, real fast is like HIPAA and GDPR categories of data.
Right.
While you might be able to store most types of data and logs a very specific kind of way, if you're logging for HIPAA and very specific types of HIPAA logs for PHI, PII, so on and so forth, which if you're doing HIPAA, that risk assessment is your friend. Without the risk assessment, I'm sure it's probably impossible to categorize these out with HIPAA. But if you grab that risk assessment with HIPAA, it's going to guide you to look at the logs that are associated with, say, storing this data for depending on the state, 6 years in some states, up to 11 years, unless some laws changed somewhere. I think the longest retention's 11 years. And then some states still have laws that say that if someone's under the age of 18 and you're gathering data about them, that has to be retained for 30 years. And that can create scenarios that can produce undue pressure on your architectures. And if not thought about ahead of time, and all of a sudden, and I've run into these failures before, and I've seen businesses get into like legal sticky red tape where they have like shelves and shelves of hard drives because they couldn't figure out how to like keep that data together and organize. And then hard drives start dying, they start losing some, they label them poorly, and then you just start getting slammed with these massive fines that some businesses might not really know how to recover from, especially if you're doing it's Office of Civil Rights stuff all of a sudden, right?
Right. Yep.
Oh, that one gets sticky.
Yeah. I went on a couple of engagements when I did audits at hospitals, and I was like, well, asking questions about where do you store your logs, and they're like, oh yeah, come with me. And then I was like, I walked into a room and it was hard drive central. It's like, oh wow, okay, there's some big old SCSI, or SCSI drives. Well, these are from the 1990s. So here's some 20 gig SCSI drives or whatever. And I was like, those just have logs on them. Yeah, we're gonna get rid of those next year because we're out of that. But yeah, it does take a lot of time and effort. How does your team handle that kind of log retention though? Because you're looking at what, potentially 6, 11, 30 years worth of logs. You're keeping petabytes potentially, especially if there's 66 billion events a day. How are you, or you being you, Blumera, how are you keeping that data fresh and available for things like e-discovery or forensics?
So that's a good question. So in terms of how that data then gets managed, so if it's for PCI data, that only has to be retained for a year. So we have everything that's in place, especially in particular for things like CMMC, PCI. It depends on the regulation. And the retention lasts for 1 year, and we keep all of our infrastructure isolated basically over zero trust architectures, where someone gets their own set of zero trust items that are walled off and isolated in the ways that the regulations approve of and agree, or like, hey, this sounds great. And also we're certified by things like AWS for how their standards recommend those securities to go. So we follow, things from those programs. If someone wants to go look down AWS certification paths, how all that works, go look down Google Cloud Platform, how some of those security standards are met, things like NIST, CMMC. And so if someone needed to keep logs for longer than that, then they would need to have basically an external way to basically cache the logs that are being sent out for storage for something like HIPAA. Just because with something like HIPAA, once again, that category of data should probably even be measured out and isolated anyways. So a lot of that then just goes back down to follow whatever the risk assessment says for data that maybe is going to not meet the requirements. And I think it's important, because the thing about Blumera is we focus on taking time and effort off of people. But then when it comes down to meeting certain regulations, something like, say, a 30-year retention, some of that is going to still fall down to the company to have to figure out how that puzzle is going to play for some of that longevity. And so I think it's important to know, what are you getting with the platform, and what is the platform already poised for? Do you need more than 1 year of log retention? And if the answer is yes, it kind of comes down to, we focus on finding like a very specific company who tends to need CMMC or PCI, or if they're using it for HIPAA, that they have an understanding of how they're going to manage outside long-term retention, things like that. So that's kind of how we approach it, both in, what do we meet right away? And then how might we approach someone who does need to meet some of these additional retention requirements and so on.
Right. Yeah. I was just thinking about that. If you're a company that's new to this space and trying to find somebody, would they expect Blue to hold on to these logs for 30 years? It sounds like if they need a long-term log retention, in terms for the future or whatever, they would do some kind of like dual routing thing where they would ship it off to an Amazon Glacier or whatever, and then send you a copy for the near term. Because I'm assuming that y'all don't want to have the liability of long-term storage and retrieval, because that would add additional overhead for y'all. Cool. So I have one more question before we go. I was just thinking out loud the other day, and I was like, well, what happens if you are using a managed service device in this case? Like, let's say you have, I don't know why you would do this, but let's say you've rented your firewall and another team is managing that, and you are not getting logs for them from whatever reason. And I'm not saying that this happens to me at work, but you don't get visibility into those logs because of something. Are there effective ways of getting telemetry from those devices without necessarily getting telemetry, like action based? I think I mentioned before this, I was like, you don't see the bomb going off, but you see things getting real crispy on the side. So is there ways to do log analysis or, from peripheral devices that would tell you, actions or activities from the thing that you're not able to get logs from?
This is something I've been hearing more common lately. And I think that perimeter defense matters. And what I mean by this is, if someone does have, say, inventory or systems that they need information from or around, there usually is some degree of perimeter contact data for how that machine is, or how that mechanism's working. And especially, you obviously will have to make sure that whatever that vendor is meeting other requirements that are going to work with your compliances. Because if it's going to mean that perhaps you can't get the log data out of a certain type of vendor, maybe they don't specialize in the kind of, say, risk category that you're trying to target. But chances are you probably have correlating data with something. Logging types, especially when you're working with SIM technologies, the difference between, say, EDR and then like endpoint detection type tools and, say, a SIM category of tool is, you have endpoint detection where you're generally monitoring one type of system with one type of logging. XDR expands that out to say, hey, let's look at multiple types of systems with one general category of logging. SIM says, let's look at as many systems that we know we need to protect based on inventory, and multiple different types of categories of logging that need to come together and create a bigger picture that tells a story about all of these systems together and all of these different types of loggings together. And that then means that in terms of knowing, so if you're bringing all of this data together, then you have information about the perimeters of where your applications and systems live, and what's coming in from a third party and what's going out from a third party. And so you can watch that data through all of your associated systems that basically have, because networks are just like highways. Even though like someone who doesn't know code necessarily might not see it this way, but if you work in code land, then everything is like a bunch of highways with like, here's a stoplight right here. Here's one that has like a speed meter or something like that over here. When people are coming in through your network, like you're able to track where they're going. It's kind of like Google Maps and networks and like a third party vendor working with you. It's kind of like if you were to just like watch them on Google Maps, you can set up scenarios like that where you're watching the points that matter and then use that what's called otherwise contextualized data from that correlation. And then contextualized data, if it meets your requirements, can then qualify you to not necessarily need those logs. And you can go to what's called a certified audit body to get that approved if you're ever not sure. And some lawyers have the capacity to certify certain things. It really depends on what they specialized in and what other additional certs they might have for who knows what. Companies like Deloitte can do that, help certify things too.
Nice. Yeah. I was just thinking, because there's always somebody out there who's like, yeah, we signed this agreement 5 years ago. Bob no longer lives here, works here. And, he didn't understand that. Or, you've got some old crufty piece of technology that you can't remove because of, legacy issues. And, it doesn't give out logs and, there's something there. I almost imagine that it exists. I'm just trying to put up that devil's advocate there, but I do appreciate that. So Nato, before we go, Blumera's hiring. Yes. I mean, what if somebody wanted to come and work with you? They're impressed by the discussion here and want to come and work with you. Are there, what is it like to, work at Blumera, and what jobs are you hiring for?
So it's very culture focused here. So basically, like everyone, I like the people here a lot. That's especially what keeps me around. And so I just like working with people I like working with. And if you had enough jobs, then that matters more than the job oftentimes. There's a lot of cool stuff going on here. We have stuff going on the engineering side for folks who might like working with, say, like technologies that are associated with DevOps and so on and so forth. So if someone's trying to get into that world and wanting to do basically SIM with like DevOps for SIM technologies, that's an option. Then we also have anyone who might have more of like a sales background, things like that. So you don't necessarily even have to be technical to work here. And then we have roles around if you're more interested in building detections and you like that process of going and seeing like, oh, this is what a threat looks like, I'm going to go and take this and then basically work in a lab and kind of figure out how this stuff works. Or you can even we should have some roles open for basically being able to work as a responder to be the one who's taking care of the situations that are happening and helping out with those actual incidents. So we have a couple of opportunities here and probably more popping up. We tend to have something new popping up all the time. So if there's not something that you see now that looks interesting, check it out later.
Yep. Yeah, we put a link in our notes here for blumera.com/careers. Like Nato says, he loves analyzing logs, which not a lot of people like doing. Documentation manager. There you go. There's another one. If you love writing some documentation, and you're gonna get deep inside the organization and the innards of this, because I'm assuming you're writing documentation with those things. That could be definitely something you would write to help the customer better understand Blumera's products. So there's definitely a way there. Like you said, there's detection incident response engineers, senior detection response engineers, but I believe Miss Berlin is one of those. And there's also back-end engineers, so they're always working on other things. So if you're in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or looks like everything is remote pretty much, so check that out. So Nato, thank you for coming on and teaching us more about Blumera and what people can get from the Blumera product and family of services. And appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.